It will help you.
Nancy, the black maid's toddler, gave the dying billionaire his inhaler and saved his life. She wasn't supposed to be there, but God works in mysterious ways, and this was no exception. What happened next would change their lives forever. The mansion stood tall at the end of a long, quiet road. Its gates were always closed, and the guards barely spoke. Inside, everything looked perfect. The floors shined like mirrors. The chandeliers sparkled softly above. Expensive paintings covered the walls, and every room carried a quiet kind of luxury. It was the kind of place anyone would wish to live in, but no one could feel the emptiness unless they lived there. Matthew, the billionaire owner of the mansion, walked slowly through the hallway that morning. His footsteps echoed in the silence. He didn't look at the paintings anymore. He didn't notice the beauty around him. Years ago, this house was full of life. His wife used to sit by the window, waiting for him with a smile. His daughter would run around, laughing, calling his name. Their voices filled every corner. Now, there was nothing. The plane crash had taken them both in one terrible moment. Since that day, Matthew became a different man. He stopped smiling. He spoke less. Sometimes he didn't speak at all. People saw his wealth and called him lucky. But deep inside, he knew the truth. Money could not bring back the people he loved, and so the mansion became quiet. One by one, housemaids came to work there, and one by one they left. Some couldn't handle his silence. Others were afraid of his sudden anger. The house felt too heavy for them. Only one maid stayed. Her name was Ada. She was simple, calm, and hardworking. She didn't complain. She didn't ask questions. She just did her job and kept going. Not because it was easy, but because she had no choice. She had a daughter to take care of. Her name was Nancy. Nancy was 5 years old, small, gentle, and full of quiet kindness. She didn't talk too much, but her eyes were bright. Even when things were hard, she still found a way to smile. One morning, Ada noticed something was wrong. Nancy was not herself. She touched her forehead. It was hot, too hot. Nancy looked weak, her body heavy, her eyes half closed. Ada felt fear rise inside her chest. She didn't have money for a proper hospital visit yet, and there was no one she could leave the child with. Missing work was not an option. If she lost this job, everything would fall apart. Ada sat still for a moment, thinking. Then she made a quiet decision. "I'll take you with me," she said softly. At the mansion, she found a small, quiet room. She laid Nancy down carefully, gave her medicine, and covered her with a light cloth. "Rest, my baby," she whispered. "I'm close." Then she went back to work, moving quickly, her mind never leaving her child. The house remained silent, until suddenly, a loud crash broke through the stillness. Ada froze. Her heart started beating fast. That sound came from Matthew's room. Something was wrong. Ada ran. Her slippers barely made a sound as she rushed down the hallway. Her heart was beating fast, and her mind was filled with fear. When she pushed open Matthew's door, she stopped in shock. He was on the floor, one hand pressed against his chest, the other stretched weakly toward the table. His face looked drained, and his breathing was rough and broken. It was clear. He couldn't breathe. "Sir!" Ada cried, rushing toward him. But she didn't know what to do first. Her hands shook as she looked around the room. Then she saw it. The inhaler. It was right there on the table. So close, yet out of reach. She moved quickly to grab it. But a small hand got there first. Ada turned. Nancy. The little girl stood there, weak but steady. She must have followed her mother, even in her sick state. "Nancy, no," Ada began, but her voice faded. Nancy had already picked up the inhaler. Slowly she walked toward Matthew. Her steps were not strong, but they were sure. She didn't rush. She didn't panic. She just moved. When she reached him, she knelt down beside him. She gently placed the inhaler into his shaking hand. "Take it," she said softly. Matthew struggled, but with her help, he managed to use it. For a moment, nothing changed. Then, a breath, a deep, shaky breath, then another. His chest began to rise more steadily. The tight grip on his body slowly loosened. Life returned to his face little by little. Ada covered her mouth in shock. He was breathing again. Nancy stayed beside him, watching quietly. Then she closed her eyes and whispered a small prayer. God, please make him okay. It was simple, pure, honest. Minutes passed. Matthew slowly opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was the little girl beside him. For a long moment, he said nothing. He just looked at her. Really looked. Not as a stranger, not as a servant's child, but as someone who had just saved his life. Ada helped him sit up, still shaken but alive. Sir, are you okay? She asked carefully. Matthew nodded slowly. His voice was weak. Yes, I am. His eyes moved back to Nancy. You helped me, he said quietly. Nancy didn't say much. She just gave a small nod. Matthew looked down at the inhaler in his hand, then back at her. Something inside him shifted. For the first time in a long while, his face softened. That same evening, everything began to change. Matthew called Ada to the living room. She stood nervously, unsure of what to expect. I heard your daughter is sick, he said. Ada lowered her head. Yes, sir. She will see a doctor. A good one, he continued. I will take care of it. Ada looked up, surprised. And you, he added gently. You are no longer just a maid in this house. Tears filled her eyes. Thank you, sir. Matthew shook his head slowly. No, he said. Thank her. He looked toward Nancy, who was resting quietly nearby. From that day on, the mansion was no longer the same. It was still big, still beautiful. But now, it had something it had lost a long time ago. Life. And for the first time since the tragedy, Matthew didn't feel alone. Because a small child had done what money never could. She gave him another chance to live. The days that followed felt different. For the first time in years, the mansion was not silent in a painful way. There was movement, there was care, there was attention. True to his word, Matthew arranged for Nancy to see a specialist in a good hospital. Not just quick treatment, but proper care. Tests were done. Medicines were given. Within days, her fever broke completely. Ada could hardly believe it. She sat by Nancy's hospital bed one evening, holding her small hand, tears quietly rolling down her face. Not tears of fear this time, but relief. You're okay, she whispered. Nancy smiled weakly. I told God to help me too. Ada laughed softly through her tears. Back at the mansion, things kept changing. Matthew was no longer the man who stayed locked away in his room. He began to come out more. At first, it was just short walks through the house. Then he started sitting in the living room again. One afternoon, he found Nancy sitting on the floor, playing quietly with a small toy. He stood there for a moment, watching her. You like this place, Humra? He asked. Nancy looked up and nodded. It's big. Matthew gave a small smile. Too big. Nancy tilted her head. Why? He paused. Then for the first time in a long while, he answered honestly. Because it had no one in it. Nancy didn't fully understand, but she slowly stood up and walked closer to him. I'm here now, she said simply. Those words stayed with him. Days later, Matthew called Ada again. This time his voice was calm, but firm. I've made a decision, he said. Ada stood quietly listening. You and your daughter will not be working here anymore. Her heart dropped instantly. Fear rushed in. Sir, please. He raised his hand gently to stop her. You won't be working here, he continued, because you will be living here. Ada froze. I don't understand, she whispered. Matthew looked toward Nancy, who was standing nearby. This house is too big for one person, he said, and I think it has been empty for too long. Ada's eyes filled with tears again. I want to take responsibility for Nancy's future, he added. Her education, her health, everything. She deserves a chance. Nancy looked between them, confused but calm. And you, he said to Ada, you deserve rest, not just survival. Ada could no longer hold back her tears. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Matthew shook his head lightly. No, he said again. Thank her. He looked at Nancy with a softness that had not been there in years. That evening, something new filled the mansion. Not just movement, not just voices, but warmth, real warmth. Laughter slowly returned. Meals were shared. Conversations, small at first, began to grow. And in quiet moments, Matthew would sit and watch Nancy play. A gentle reminder of the life he had lost, but also the life he had been given again. He didn't forget his past, but he was no longer trapped in it, because a small child, with a weak body but a strong heart, had done something powerful. She didn't just save his life. She gave him a reason to live again, and this time he chose not to waste it. Life in the mansion slowly found a new rhythm. Mornings were no longer quiet and heavy. There was the soft sound of footsteps, the clink of plates, and sometimes laughter. Small at first, but real. Nancy grew stronger each day. Her energy returned, and so did her smile. She would walk around the house freely now, no longer confined to a corner or a bed. Matthew noticed everything. The way she greeted him every morning. The way she said thank you, even for the smallest things. The way she closed her eyes to pray before eating. It touched something deep inside him. One evening, as the sun set through the large windows, Matthew sat in the living room. Nancy sat on the floor nearby, drawing with colored pencils. He watched her quietly. "What are you drawing?" he asked. Nancy held up the paper. It was a simple drawing. 3 people standing in front of a big house. "This is you," she said, pointing. Then she pointed again. "This is Mummy." Finally, she smiled. "And this is me." Matthew stared at the drawing longer than expected. A family. Something he thought was gone forever. His throat tightened slightly, but this time, he didn't look away. Instead, he nodded slowly. "It's beautiful." That night, he made one final decision. The next morning, he called Ada and Nancy to sit with him. They both came, unsure but calm. Matthew took a deep breath. "I want to make this official," he said. Ada looked confused. "Sir?" "I have spoken to my lawyer," he continued. "Everything is being arranged." He paused, then looked directly at Nancy. "I want to adopt you." Silence filled the room. Ada's eyes widened in shock. Nancy simply blinked, trying to understand. "You will go to the best schools," Matthew said gently. "You will have every opportunity, and you will never have to worry about tomorrow again." He turned to Ada. "And you will always have a place here, not as a worker, but as family." Tears rolled freely down Ada's face. "Sir, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he replied softly. Nancy stood up and walked toward him. "Does that mean you'll be my daddy?" she asked. Matthew's eyes softened. "Yes," he said quietly, "if you'll have me." Nancy smiled, then wrapped her small arms around him. That simple hug broke the last wall in his heart. Matthew held her gently, closing his eyes for a moment. For the first time in years, he felt whole. Weeks later, the papers were signed. It was official. Nancy had a new home, and Matthew had a daughter again. The mansion was no longer just a symbol of wealth. It became a home, a place filled with second chances, a place where pain met healing, and where a dying man, saved by a child's kindness and prayer, found life again. Because sometimes the greatest miracles don't come with noise or power. They come quietly, through love, through faith, and through the smallest hands that refuse to give up.